Take a look at the cuff of your shirt. That small, simple disc of plastic or shell seems unremarkable. A basic fastener we assume has been with us forever. But for millennia, this humble object was little more than a jewel, a decorative flourish reserved for the powerful and the elite, entirely useless for holding anything together. The true revolution wasn't the button itself, but the quiet invention of its partner, the humble buttonhole. That small, reinforced slit is what transformed an ornament into a tool. Let's trace the thread from medieval fashion statements to the simple utility that now holds your coat together, revealing how a small loop fundamentally changed the course of material culture. Today, we pull on this unseen thread and discover the world it unravels. To understand the button's journey, we first have to unlearn our modern assumptions. We see it as a fastener, but for most of its history, it was anything but. When we sift through the archaeological record, the earliest objects we might call buttons emerged from the Indus Valley Civilization around 2000 BCE. Carved from seashell and shaped into geometric forms, these discs, according to scholarly analysis, show no evidence of being used for fastening. Instead, they were likely ornaments, sewn flat onto clothing as a silent testament to wealth or spiritual significance, a concept that would echo for the next 3,000 years. The ancient Greeks and Romans, masters of engineering and architecture, secured their famous togas and chitons not with buttons, but with pins, brooches known as fibulae, and simple knots. Their sartorial world was one of draping, not tailoring. Buttons existed? Certainly, but archival inventories and recovered artifacts from the era show them made of precious materials like ivory and bone, used as decorative toggles or singular, showy ornaments on a scabbard or pouch. The button was an accessory, a piece of jewelry that just happened to be attached to cloth. It possessed status, but it lacked purpose. For centuries, it was a solution waiting for a problem, its true potential lying dormant within a simple, solid disc. The great shift begins not with a bang, but with a slice. The true protagonist of our story's first act, the unsung hero, appears in the 13th century within the burgeoning tailor shops of the Germanic states. It is the buttonhole, a simple, reinforced slit in the fabric. This was not a lightning strike invention credited to a single genius. Rather, as studies of medieval textiles suggest, it was an incremental innovation, a practical answer to a new desire for more form-fitting clothes. As tailoring techniques advanced, moving away from the loose tunics of the early Middle Ages, there was a growing need for a closure that was both secure and adjustable. The old methods of lacing and pinning were cumbersome and ill-suited for the snug sleeves and bodices coming into vogue. Suddenly, the button had its call to adventure. The pairing was perfect. A row of small, tightly spaced buttons and buttonholes could create a seamless, tailored fit that was previously unimaginable. Yet, this functional marriage did not immediately democratize the button. Quite the opposite. As historical fashion plates and sumptuary laws of the period reveal, its first functional application was an explosion of conspicuous consumption among the European nobility. A single sleeve might be adorned with 24 buttons made of silver, gold, or gemstone. This wasn't just about a better fit. It was about demonstrating that one had the immense wealth to afford not only the precious materials, but also the skilled labor of a tailor who could meticulously stitch each corresponding buttonhole. The button, now paired with its revolutionary partner, had found its purpose. But it was still firmly shackled to the world of aristocratic display. It was a tool, yes, but a tool of the 1%, poised on the edge of a world it was about to completely remake. The moment the button and buttonhole were united, a profound change began to ripple across the social fabric of Europe. The 14th century witnessed what can only be described as a sartorial explosion. If we examine the art and literature of the time, from the illuminated manuscripts of the Très Riches Heures du Duc de Berry to Chaucer's vivid descriptions in the Canterbury Tales, we see a dramatic shift in silhouette. The loose, draped tunics of the Romanesque period gave way to the tightly fitted doublets, pourpoints, and gowns of the late Middle Ages. This wasn't merely a fleeting trend. It was a technological disruption made possible entirely by our humble fastener. A single garment could now feature over 100 buttons, running from chin to waist or wrist to elbow, creating a tailored form that was both a marvel of engineering and a billboard of personal wealth. This sudden, insatiable demand created an economic shockwave. Button making, once a niche craft practiced by jewelers, erupted into a standalone industry. When we delve into the guild records of major cities like Paris and London, we find the formal establishment of boutonnières, professional button makers with their own charters, standards, and trade secrets. They were masters of their craft, working with an incredible array of materials. Economic treatises from the period detail a bustling trade in buttons made from wood, bone, and horn for the lower classes, pewter, brass, and copper for the burgeoning merchant class, and extravagant creations of silver, gold, hand-painted enamel, and precious gems for the nobility. An entire ecosystem, complete with material suppliers, artisans, and merchants, materialized around this single, small object. The button was no longer just an accessory. It was an engine of commerce. With this new economy came a powerful new visual language of social class. The button became an immediate and undeniable signifier of one's place in the world. A peasant's rough-spun tunic might be held together with a simple wooden toggle, while a wealthy merchant could afford a row of polished pewter buttons on his doublet. A nobleman, however, might wear a fortune on his sleeve, with each button being a miniature work of art. This created a new form of social anxiety and aspiration. We can even see the lingering echoes of this era in our clothing today. The now standard practice of placing men's buttons on the right and women's on the left is hypothesized by many historians of material culture to have originated in this period. Men, who typically dress themselves, found it easier to button from the right. Noble women, however, were often dressed by servants, so the buttons were placed on the left to be more convenient for a right-handed person standing opposite them. The button, in its very placement, was encoding the social structure of its time. This blatant display of wealth did not go unnoticed by the ruling class. As the merchant class grew richer, they began to imitate the fashions of the aristocracy, including the extravagant use of expensive buttons. In response, governments enacted what are known as sumptuary laws, regulations designed to curb expenditure and reinforce class distinctions. Legal documents from France, England, and Italy explicitly dictated who was allowed to wear buttons made of gold, silver, or imported materials. In some cases, the number of buttons one could wear was legally restricted based on their annual income. The button had become so potent a symbol of upward mobility that the establishment literally made it a crime to wear the wrong kind. This was the button's ordeal. A battle fought not on a field, but on the very fabric of society, pitting tradition against aspiration and class against capital. Yet, beneath this noisy conflict of status, the button's true power, its quiet utility, was steadily winning. While nobles used buttons for show, soldiers, sailors, and craftsmen were beginning to adopt them for pure function. Military uniform archives show how buttons provided a secure and reliable fastening for jackets and gaiters, crucial in the heat of action. The simple, durable button was becoming an indispensable piece of technology for those who valued practicality over pageantry. The button was leading a double life. In the halls of power, it was a jewel, a statement, a weapon in the war of social perception. But in the streets, workshops, and barracks, it was becoming something far more revolutionary. A quiet, reliable servant. The stage was now set for its final transformation, as the fires of a new industrial age promised to strip it of its aristocratic pretension and finally unleash its democratic potential for all. The Industrial Revolution was a crucible, and when the button emerged from its fire, it was transformed forever. The ornate, handcrafted symbol of the aristocracy was melted down and recast as a product for the masses. The 18th and 19th centuries saw an unprecedented wave of innovation, not in the button's form, but in its very substance and creation. When we examine the patent drawings from this era, we don't see artists. We see engineers. Men like John Wesley Hyatt, who in the 1860 seconds invented celluloid, the first semi-synthetic plastic, were not trying to create jewelry. They were solving a manufacturing problem: how to create a cheap, durable, and consistent substitute for expensive materials like ivory and horn. Factories sprang up in Birmingham, New York, and across Germany, their machines stamping, pressing, and molding buttons by the tens of thousands. Archival factory records from the period document the shift with stark numbers, showing production rates that would have been unimaginable to a medieval boutonniere. The button's value was no longer in its rarity or the preciousness of its material, but in its uniformity and availability. New materials followed in quick succession: vulcanized rubber, early composites, and eventually bakelite. The button was now a child of chemistry and mass production. Its DNA had been rewritten. With mass production came the need for standardization, and it's here that we witness the quiet triumph of pure, unadorned function. The four-hole button, which we now consider the default, rose to prominence not for aesthetic reasons, but because its design was perfectly suited for the industrial sewing machines that were simultaneously revolutionizing garment manufacturing. Four holes allowed for a stronger, more stable attachment with a crisscrossing thread, a simple piece of mechanical logic that cemented its dominance. The button's evolution was now inextricably linked to the machines that made both it and the clothes it fastened. It had become a cog in a much larger system of industrial modernism, a small, perfect circle of efficiency. Through this process, the button achieved its ultimate victory. It became invisible. By the 20th century, it was so ubiquitous, so utterly commonplace, that it ceased to be noticed at all. It was no longer a signifier of class or a feat of craftsmanship. It was simply there, a reliable piece of technology that performed its job without fanfare. From military uniforms to business suits, from work shirts to children's clothes, the button was the silent partner in the fabric of modern life. It had completed its hero's journey, not by slaying a dragon, but by integrating itself so completely into the ordinary world that we forgot it ever had an extraordinary past. It had returned with the elixir, and the elixir was convenience itself. So the next time your fingers close around that simple disc on your cuff, pause for a moment. Feel the cool, smooth surface of an object that carries the weight of empires, the heat of forges, and the quiet ambition of centuries. What you are holding is not just a fastener. It is the final page in a story of revolution, a tiny monument to the unseen threads that connect our simplest actions to the grand, complex tapestry of human history.